Hello and welcome back to Everything is Ideology. I'm your host, Dr. Lee Kaplan. Today I'm joined by Max Blansjaar and Jacob Kingsbury Downs for a wide-ranging conversation on their article on Taylor Swift and Broken Glass, Confessional Pop, Psychological Intimacy, and Two-Way Authentication. We explore why honesty has become such a central aesthetic category in popular music and what it means when listeners begin to understand themselves through the artists they consume. Throughout the conversation, we discuss how confessional pop music creates what Max and Jacob describe as a two-way authentication, where listeners are not simply consuming an artist's private life, but actively projecting themselves into the music. We think through the politics of intimacy, headphone listening, TikTok fandom, neoliberal selfhood, indie aesthetics, and the blurred boundary between performer and listener. Along the way, we unpack the genealogy of confessional expression, from mid-century poetry to singer-songwriters like Joni Mitchell and contemporary pop icons, asking how authenticity itself became a marketable aesthetic. We also spend time thinking about fragmentation, mirrors, broken glass, fantasy imagery, monstrosity, reinvention, and the strange tension between vulnerability and capitalism in Taylor Swift's music and public persona. We close by reflecting on the ethical and political stakes of confessional culture more broadly, from celebrity branding and fandom to politics, social media, and the contemporary obsession with rawness and transparency. If you like what we do here, please become a patron at patreon.com/everythingisideology or give a one-time donation at buymeacoffee.com/everythingisideology. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everything is Ideology. I'm Dr. Lee Kaplan, and today I'm joined by two wonderful, excellent scholars, pop music scholars, et cetera, et cetera. We'll get to know them. And we already know Max Blansjaar, who's a musician and writer from Amsterdam in the Netherlands. He holds a BA in music from St. Catherine's College, University of Oxford, where he was awarded the Gibbs Prize by the Faculty of Music in 2024. His work centers around cultural politics and popular music and the negotiation of social identities and relations through music and sound, with recent essays published in Sound Studies, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, and the Journal of Extreme Anthropology, as well as popular magazines Dirt, The Mortar, and The Story. He currently holds a Clarendon Scholarship at Jesus College, University of Oxford. We're also joined by Dr. Jacob Kingsbury Downs. He's a departmental lecturer in music and chair of faculty in the Faculty of Music, as well as organizing tutor in music at Lady Margaret Hall. He is an honorary research fellow at the University of Sheffield. He studies listeners' and musicians' experiences with music and sound technologies, combining qualitative empirical materials with historical research and theoretical approaches drawn from the fields of musicology, sound studies, phenomenological philosophy, and music psychology. He's currently working on two book projects. He received his PhD from the University of Sheffield in 2021, studying under Nicola Dippin. All right, excellent. Thanks so much for taking the time to be here. And it's also sometimes, it's wonderful to figure out stuff, cross collaborations in terms of like, we're in different time zones. And that's a whole other sort of interesting thing to kind of figure out and think through as well. So, you guys wrote about Taylor Swift at a time when it was impossible not to even talk about Taylor Swift in some sort of way, right? You even in the article mentioned like this is the moment or something of a Taylor Swift. But she also seems to be like the flagship point or a way into discussing a larger sociological phenomena, which is like weirdly implicated with terms of like the self. You discuss possible tensions between narcissism and music and sort of like authentication, and you have all of these different things, right? So your piece is called On Taylor Swift and Broken Glass, Confessional Pop, Psychological Intimacy, and Two-Way Authentication. So would you mind just discussing a little bit about these concepts that you use as a way to define stuff to then kind of dig into other materials we'll get into in the discussion?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I guess the sort of the jumping off point was the sort of the idea of authenticity, which obviously is really annoying and difficult to sort of pin down. But it was the jumping off point was about, okay, so in what we might call confessional pop music, of which Taylor Swift is an example, or was, as you say, at that point, kind of the example that was the most difficult to avoid in a way. In confessional pop music, how is authenticity kind of like signaled? How is it created, and what effect does that have on both the performer and on the listener? And so I think one of the first or one of the early reference points we use is Alan Moore and his article on authenticity as authentication, and like three different types, if you like, of authenticity: first person, third person, and second person. um, and how in some ways, so one of those is that in kind of confessional pop music, when we believe the singer to be like telling the truth in some way about their life or expressing something about their life, this kind of authenticates the performer, because what they're saying is rooted in real experience, and this is somehow like a desirable quality to have as an artist in our current like cultural climate. Um, but the thing that we kind of dig into is what is the effect of that on the listener? And is there perhaps also, as well as functioning as a kind of window into the pop musician's psyche, might the music also function in some way as a mirror for listeners to kind of authenticate their own sense of self and their own identity? So I guess that was kind of the jumping off point. Do you have anything to add about that?
Yeah, so I guess, you focused in there on confessionality and authenticity, and I think the word that I'm really interested in here is intimacy, and particularly the idea that intimacy is a sort of two-way thing. We got sort of a inspiration from Nicola Dibben's work on the intimate singing voice, and specifically this idea that pop recordings that feature a sort of close-up voice could be read in some way as revealing something about the industry that functions basically on the consumption of private lives. So by listening to a voice that appears intimate to you, you might hear cues in it that remind you of, friends, family, close people to you, and sort of therefore perceive your relationship with them in a certain way as though they are confessing truthfully to you. And I think one of the things that feels sort of missing in the intimacy literature is that there is this focus on it being about consuming private lives. It's sort of, one directional, if you see what I mean. And we were interested here in trying to understand a little bit more about how the listener really does feature in this. There's a kind of reciprocity.
No, that's great. There's certainly an agency happening here on the part of the listener, very much so, because the listener seems to be creating the thing that allows it to be authentic. So the listener has an image of what authenticity is, and then an expectation of that authenticity to exist. And once they hear it, then the artist becomes artist, right? It only seems like something with like through the performance of honesty in this work, does the artist become an artist? Like honesty seems to be the medium which that the artist needs to travel through to then become authenticated and an artist. Agency also comes up in this regard, as you guys write, is that um, the listener understands themselves through the aesthetic performance of the song. So it's the two-way authentication thing happening, right? So it's sort of this interesting give and take relationship. There's more of a relationship, a dialectical relationship happening rather than just brute sort of consumption. Like a person listens to this music and it's written in such a vague way, as you talk about in your anti-hero example, that the I in that song could be anyone. It could be anyone, and you just sort of fill it in some way. And so, would you mind talking about the sort of relationship that the listener will have to the artist?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I guess the key thing is that, and this is sort of bound up with like developments in technology and the way that people even listen to music in the first place, and uh, the kind of the mediation, I guess, of their like interaction with the music. But I guess the key thing that you see changing, if we think about, I'm going to be really kind of broad strokes now and say like, the development of headphone technology, ubiquitization of headphone technology, things like TikTok, social media, and the kind of ways that people consume and share music on there. The key thing with that is that the music is kind of it's emanating from, it seems to be emanating from the listener in some way. So if you're wearing headphones, and I guess we can get more into technology in a bit, but like if you're wearing headphones, it feels in some way as though the voice of the singer is like inside your own head, and so the line between you and them is blurred in some way. Similarly, if you think about like TikTok and you think about lip sync on TikTok, which is something that you get a lot, or even just like the way that people use music in general to kind of aestheticize their lives, the experience of their lives. Again, the boundary is sort of blurred between the listener and the artist. Again, it's not just like a one way you're consuming and you're listening, but also you're kind of through the listening, you're performing something about the music that comes through. And so the relationship between the listener and the artist becomes like, in a way, much more unstable and like a lot less separate. And I think that is where, with Taylor Swift, you get this a really strong like desire, or a really strong uh, it's almost like identification is encouraged in some way. And this is where the vagueness is really helpful from a kind of commercial perspective, because it's like, how can you let as many people as possible relate to this music? And that's something that she's been really successful at, evidently.
Mm. Yeah, there's a sort of creative dimension to it. I think that's interesting that, you know, this tension that there is between, I don't know, understanding a separation between yourself and who you're listening to. You know, generally speaking, we understand fan culture so much through this idolization, this very much sort of separation, if you like. But indeed, when you're experiencing something in such an intimate, such a personal way, there really can feel like there is, you know, it's not necessarily you're merging with that person, but you can almost try on that sort of identity, right? One of the things we write about in the article as well is kind of a comparison with, I don't know, fashion. You know, the fact that often people will sort of emulate the fashion of a particular celebrity that they're interested in. So there's a kind of, you know, it's almost like trying on different aspects of identity to some degree. And in that way, this reading that we do of Taylor Swift is, I think, definitely related to a longer history of understanding the history of, say, girl groups and other performers as kind of, I don't know, representing or performing a particular kind of femininity through this sort of media form. So yeah, it's just a kind of, it's not necessarily to say that Taylor Swift is in any way entirely unique, but that she represents something like a kind of peak of this wave that we're on.
No, that's great. There's a few things that brings up in mind. It's that the idea of consumption sort of is either a consumption of self in some way or other, or a mix of the two. So some music becomes exoticized, and that's something that we might enjoy about it, and it gets into this like Orientalist notions of stuff and what does that mean and look like, and how do the constructions of the other. But this is a construction of the self, and seeing oneself through the other and legitimizing one's own experience through the other. So if you're like, oh, if Taylor went through this, right, and you construct whatever Taylor went through in your own head, and you're like, well, I went through that too, so I have so much in common with her. It lends this sense of blending, which ultimately kind of reflects neoliberal logics of blending and seeing yourself within the product, and then therefore also becoming part of the product as well. But I just wanted to back up a little bit because you mentioned that Taylor Swift isn't just the only person, right? So you sort of trace a kind of history, a sort of genealogy, starting in the 1950s of just confessional poetry. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind talking us through a little bit of the confessional poetry, confessional poems, et cetera, that sort of register, to then the transition to popular music.
Yeah. So, I mean, as you say, it's in the 1950s, and I think it seems sometimes as though like musical developments are always a little bit behind kind of developments in other art forms in this sense. But like, or maybe not, maybe behind is too derogatory. Like it's always
I don't know.
happens a little later. But like, yeah, so we I think we quote this critic Emil Rosenthal, who kind of comments in the 1950s that there's a real explosion around that time of confessional poetry, or poetry written in a kind of confessional register. So kind of around that time, you think of like is it Sylvia Plath,
Mhm.
like, you know, Anne Sexton or whatever, these people. And then a little bit later than that, I wouldn't really say it's a huge thing in the 50s, but like if you think about the 60s and music of the counterculture, um, and, you know, artists like, I don't know, like Bob Dylan, and then after you know, Joni Mitchell and people like this, who really, the big selling point, if you like, or the big, uh, uh, the thing about their music that felt different was the fact that they were expressing something kind of profound or quote unquote raw about their lives. And so they positioned themselves as like in opposition to the mainstream, which was, you know, manufactured, contrived, impersonal, and this kind of thing. And so that was the kind of dichotomy that was set up. It was like, on the one hand, you have like raw, authentic, confessional singers, and on the other hand, you have inauthentic, commercial, kind of lying pop stars. Whether or not that's like something that really exists, like a dichotomy that really exists, is a different question. But I think that's certainly that's certainly how it was kind of played out, and arguably kind of still is. And so what we then sort of trace is how this this line of thinking, this like idea of the confessional singer being in some way authentic, set against the kind of commercial mainstream, kind of really accretes into a set of aesthetic principles and becomes a lot more widespread in popular music over the course of the 20th century and then into the 21st. And if you think now about, like, so I think an example that we gave, like if you think about indie music subculture in the 1980s and 1990s, that referred back then to like a very specific kind of music with very particular material conditions, like, you know, not signed to a major record label and all of this kind of thing. Whereas now, I mean, if you go on Spotify now and look like what's called indie music now, it's like you'd probably find Taylor Swift on there, find, you know, whoever, like Noah Khan or something. I don't know.
Phoebe Bridges.
Phoebe Bridges. You know, all of this stuff, which is like, you know, really music that's very much attached to like the major institutions of the music industry, which sort of signifies, I think, the infiltration of these aesthetic principles into mainstream culture. This idea that in order to be authentic, or in order to be true, the listener must be the singer must adopt this kind of confessional register.
Yeah, I think this is exactly it. And then there's a sort of, again, this tension that you were starting to mention, Lee, about kind of the neoliberal condition of wanting to not necessarily even just to align with the product, but also to identify products in the product. I don't know, I've been thinking a lot about this most recent Taylor Swift record, and there's that song about Elizabeth Taylor where if you actually listen to the lyrics, it's quite fascinating because it's almost like she just splits up every line into something else. Nothing really connects at all. And there's this sort of sense that she just, I don't know, is there an authenticity in her imagining herself into Elizabeth Taylor? Or is she literally just going, you know, Elizabeth Taylor? There's something so bizarre about Taylor Swift. And I think this is why we've sort of found her at this, you know, contemporary point that we're at the end of this genealogy of what has essentially always been seen as authentic across the years. And I think still to some degree we would see Joni Mitchell as the kind of, I don't know, the archetype of the authentic singer-songwriter, for example. And then when you actually think about this sort of genealogy with Taylor Swift at the end, it seems bizarre because in a way they're not at all similar. You know, there's that Joni Mitchell quote that time about did you see this when they were talking about doing a biopic of Joni Mitchell's life, and there was a rumor that it was going to be Taylor Swift doing it, and Joni Mitchell was like, well, good luck to her to be able to sing like me.
Yeah, didn't she also, was that Joni Mitchell who was like, someone asked her what she thought about Taylor Swift and she was like, wonderful gowns?
Aretha Franklin.
Yeah,
that was that's a great interview. I know all of the diss interviews about Taylor Swift.
Right.
That's great. And this idea of the interview is absolutely crucial to understanding authenticity and honesty within it. So this brings up the question, sort of like, there's successes and failures and so many weird things happening. So we are kind of mediating the image of that person. And there's a lot of different sort of popular cultural music studies about like, who is this person and the ways in which they're created, and they're created by different fandoms. And so in the article, you also talk about how some articles see Taylor Swift as representing a form of sort of queerness, and this like underlying queer stuff going on as well. So people could read different aspects and have their own version of Taylor, which also works really well for her economic benefit, and especially in terms of creating like the Taylor's version stuff. And I thought that was a really brilliant sort of connection to make insofar as like, um, Taylor Swift is all about honesty, and now she needs to make her own versions of the songs, but it's really just about economic control. And I thought that was a really interesting dovetail in terms of sort of like um, biographical and ways of selling the self and ways of also accumulating profit as well. So I was wondering if you could talk about big question, how do we create an artist? Who is the artist? Because I was sort of like, I was writing down questions for the interview, and I was like, listeners can't handle the truth. They're not ready for the truth. Like, I was writing all of these things. I had to delete all of them, obviously. But, who is the artist in this regard?
That's a good question.
Well, it kind of, I guess we say at the end of the article, right? Taylor Swift is whoever you want her to be. I think this is the absolute genius of Taylor Swift, is that I really have no idea what is the truth or not, except for my absolutely true, the term that they're using now in internet culture is headcanon. My headcanon of Taylor Swift is that she is a very specific person who represents a very specific thing. And, someone else, perhaps more of her idealized listener, will have a completely different headcanon of Taylor Swift to me, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also, like, I mean, you said you talked about these Taylor's version releases and how they kind of work to to kind of strengthen her like monopoly of the music industry or whatever, and like they also sort of like clog up vinyl production lines and things like this. But of course, that's like a tension. There's a tension there between like this narrative of her breaking free from her like commercial overlords, and on the other hand, also like becoming a billionaire in the same move. And like those are both those are both reasons for thinking she is like two completely different things. And like, depending on who you speak to, she's like, a corporate swindler, or she's someone who's finally broke free from like a particular kind of contract or whatever it is. And like, so it's just about what like you said, what she's seems to be really successful at is creating narratives that just are really super open-ended and open to interpretation in lots of different ways. Because I think it's not the case really anymore that people have to engage with like a particular image of her. Like we don't all have to watch like MTV and kind of get the same idea of who someone is. Like people go down, like these people who believe that Taylor Swift is like harboring a secret queer identity. Like there are rabbit holes, for want of a better phrase, on social media that just allow those people to not really see anything else. You know what I mean? And so it's about creating a really like malleable image that then can be taken in lots of different ways.
Yeah, and these tensions that you're outlining there, escaping corporate overlords and also like hyper capitalists, they're sort of irreconcilable. And I think in so many ways about the kind of representation that people have in their heads of Taylor Swift, there are so many of these tensions that just don't really work. I think to me, what she does so well is portray a kind of coherent whole. This is Taylor Swift, while also fragmenting everything so much. Famously, all the pop musicians beef with her. Billie Eilish and Charlie XCX, of sort of, because she keeps releasing different versions of the same thing so that she stays at the top of the charts. But she does this in a way which she hides any sense that this might be a commercial enterprise behind the fact that it's, for example, song X brackets voice note version, or whatever, voice memo demo, or whatever. Oh, that rhymes. But, this sort of idea that this is something that she recorded on her phone. We're getting complete, unveiled access to the inner technological life and sort of creative world of Taylor Swift. So there's that sort of, as I say, you cannot reconcile that tension, but it's nonetheless so successful. I think that's what fascinates me the most about her.
Yeah, I will also say, like, in answer to your question of how do we create an artist, I mean, it might sound now as if like we're saying that individual listeners are able to construct any image of Taylor Swift that they like. And of course, that's kind of partly true, but also that we know a lot about how artists and their teams are able to construct particular narratives, put them out as if organic on social media, and kind of push people to engage in a certain way. Like, I wouldn't be surprised at all, and like this is completely unsubstantiated claim, I wouldn't be surprised at all if the narrative that like Taylor Swift was was secretly gay was like put out by a member of her team and then, you know, kind of picked up organically.
She's probably got a full-time member of Taylor as queer on her team.
No,
I think there's probably
right.
someone for each different conspiracy.
So I just don't want to make it sound like we're like ignoring the power that these, but we're just saying that there's a lot of them.
It's controlling narratives so well, but it's this tension, this fragmentation versus the coherent whole. I think it's just the genius stroke of Taylor Swift that there's enough of a gap for you to fill in, but of course the actual substance of what we've got there is deeply controlled. Yeah, you've put it really well.
Interesting. So it seems like this constructed or space of sort of ignorance provides a space to provide what we want to see. So the lack of Taylor Swift, we fill it in with a reflection of ourselves in some way. And it seems like, to me, I wrote down Taylor Swift is whatever sells. So there's something like that happening, right? Which is part of also her lyrics as well. I want to sort of back up for a second because this indie thing is super interesting to me. So there's a lot of aspects of indie that people talk about, sort of like whiteness, gender, et cetera, et cetera. And there's also sort of the sound or the politics of intimacy at play within indie music, specifically because it's like personally done. It's not like the recording thing. But it goes from that sort of thing to actually now meaning honesty. And whereas honesty used to be sort of this countercultural device against like overproduced glittery stuff or something like this, the raw, now sort of raw is seen as a mainstream aesthetic in some way. I was just kind of curious if you guys could talk about that or how it happened or however you want to take that question.
Yeah. I mean, I guess in a way, like you could read this as being like almost a development in the structure of the economy and how the economy works, in the sense that, you know, our industrial economies were kind of built around kind of mass production and kind of uniformity and standardization, and this was like what people associated with, I'm putting it really basically now, but like what people associated with like the dominant mode of kind of capitalist production, whereas of course post-industrial economies function very differently, and are built like, you know, commercial products are built a lot more around, like, even if you just look at how commercial products are marketed to you now, you know, it's like everywhere you look, you see like the rhetoric of difference, of going against the grain, of being an individual. And like, you know, you can put it in terms of like biopower, or you can put it in terms of, you know, kind of like how post-Fordist economy works. But like, I think there is a reading of this where you say, well, the changes that you see in popular music and this shift towards like you know, an interest in like aesthetics of alterity and of honesty are exactly the same as the changes that you see in other areas of the economy. And so you see pop music as just, you know, another industry in which this has happened. So I think that's one like line of thinking that I've been finding pretty compelling recently. Yeah.
Sort of artisanal mode of, as you sort of hipster aesthetics, as you're sort of interested in. And I guess, you know, even like supermarket bread products, they say, you know, homemade recipe or something like this, you know, obviously it's unbelievable, but it's kind of packaged in a way which appears at least to feel grassroots or sort of,
there's a bus line here called the Oxford Tube that basically takes you from Oxford into London, and they've just unveiled their new tagline. Have you seen it?
No.
It's the tagline is, "It's an Oxford Tube thing." And and I'm like, what does that mean? But it's like, it's in my opinion, really lousy like attempt to construct a sort of in-group out of like being on a bus, I guess. So I don't know. I just thought of that as like another way. To me, that's kind of it's kind of the same thing. But
sort of empty signifiers of some sense of, as you say, community, collectivity, some kind of grouping, but actually it just really is kind of nonsensical because it's trying to create the group in terms of a community that doesn't really have any identity.
Yeah.
God, poor Oxford Tube, we're really
I know.
destroying them here.
Anyway, we can talk about that more maybe another time. But yeah, so I think what you see with indie music, and I mean, so there's an article in Paste magazine from like 2010 by Rachel Maddox, who has been she'd been following indie music for a long time, and she basically says indie music is dead because it kind of means anything you want it to now, because like the aesthetic tenets that we always associated with indie are just like now completely ubiquitous, which is interesting.
No, that's great. I mean, it's the idea that now honesty is sort of a lie insofar as it's just a very clear performance of something. Like you're mediating and using the aesthetics of honesty to sell something in a dishonest way. It's disingenuous. So now you have this dialectic where it's like to be honest is to lie in certain ways, right? And to be unique is also to be the same as well. Like the whole it's a tube thing and all this business. It's creating something to seem unique that isn't unique, right? It's selling quirkiness in some way. And what this does is it repackages sort of individualism in like this fun product way, which reproduces a sense of like individualism and also like I don't see what's wrong with see it, say it, sorted, all about it. Um, so I think that is an incredibly interesting thing to sort of just look at kind of how these products shifted over time as a result of disingenuous kind of marketing strategies in some way. But there's also a sense in which Taylor Swift's own aesthetic production lends itself very nicely to this reading. Like it seemed like you guys just picked up on something that was very, very there. There's something very there within her own music. And she's very aware that she's sort of a cultural product that can be placed in different ways, because she's constantly changing herself. Her lyrics attribute it to that sort of thing. She has a song very clearly, the mirror ball sort of thing. I even had a student write about like the mirror ball as like a theory too, and that was a really lovely read. It was an undergraduate class too, so that was really fun to see. Um, but and just sort of theorizing what this mirror ball kind of is and what it looks like, right? But it seems like we become ourselves through others in this sort of really weird way now, that's happening. And of course, what happens then if we find out everything is a lie, which is the big sort of risk here that will happen. But I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how Taylor Swift's music lends itself to this form of authenticity.
Totally. I really want to read your student's essay. It sounds great.
Yeah, it
I'll
does.
send it.
I guess. Well, there's a couple of things. I might first talk about production, like the way that her music is produced. I mean, again, and this maybe we could talk more about technologies of listening now. Like if you think about just where is the voice coming from and how does it sound? So like the way a lot of her music is produced by Jack Antonoff nowadays, and like the way that he produces like almost every song that is made, and the way that he does it is like there's usually this kind of like centrally emerging voice and kind of the instrumentation around it as though the voice is kind of like emerging from the middle of the mix. And listening to that through headphones, it really does feel as though like the voice is emerging somehow as if from out of your own body, and it's not coming from outside. It doesn't sound weird or in like a weird space. It's super I mean, not necessarily dry, but it's naturalistic. And so that's one way in sort of a production sense that you can really like encourage identification with this voice. It would be really totally different if it was like, a distorted or sounding super far away or something. That's just one really simple way. I don't know. Do you want to say something about like lyrics or something?
Yeah, I guess like one of the things we really found out, that kind of going back to a lot of the stuff about she can mean lots of different things or whatever, but the authenticity side comes also strangely in her use of fantastical imagery. To me, there's this sort of sense that it's not that she's trying to therefore portray herself as a kind of fantastical being in any necessary sense. But there's a sort of, I don't know, in the fact that she blurs the disparity between, blurs the distinction at all between the real and the fictional in this way. In a way, it kind of, I don't know, makes the whole thing seem more credible, right? We sort of focus in on this track of hers, Anti-Hero, where she uses all these different forms of imagery, you know, sort of thinking about, she imagines herself as Godzilla figure. In the video, she's sort of like Alice from Alice's Inventions in Wonderland, you know, oversized, grotesque in this way. I suppose to me, the authenticity often comes through, and I think this is one of the big kind of conditions of a sort of mediated intimacy, is particularly the idea of the sense that she is vulnerable. You know, she portrays herself regularly as the most hated, or, you know, someone who is ostracized or whatever. And, you know, you just think, you're a billionaire. Like, what? Seriously? But it's so convincing. Like, I don't know, there's so much about the way that she packages it that it makes you feel like, oh, I feel really sorry for you, and you're really opening up to me, so I buy into this. You know, that to me is amazing. You know, that sort of vulnerability, that sort of innocence in a way.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, yeah. So I guess also another thing that the kind of fantastical or sort of fairy tale like imagery does is, like, I mean, fairy tales generally are about like types that are, I mean, they're not always super rounded characters. They're like flat character types that you like associate with particular things. And I think what she's good at with lyrics is just like conjuring up these images, be it like fairy tale images or like romantic images, that are I don't, yeah, I mean, not necessarily cliches, although they sometimes are, but like just these kind of broad strokes, I guess, uh, broad strokes characters, or like broad strokes emotions that you can kind of fill in how you want.
Mm.
I feel like sort of the self-critique is necessary for it to feel honest in some way, because if she was being sort of rather braggadocious or something, it wouldn't seem very honest. There's something about bragging that just feels like sort of maybe overcompensating or something like this, whereas like honesty requires sort of like self-disparaging remarks and critiques. And then from there, you know, a lot of people, it's easy to tune in to be like, you know, she's just like me despite having all this money, which obviously plays into sort of like the neoliberal like idea that like, oh man, you know, money doesn't buy happiness. You know, they still have all of these problems. They're just like me, right? Meanwhile, like this is obviously creative for a specific demographic, for a specific audience. And the blending of like the monstrous imagery with sort of like aspects of biography sort of makes me think that like she's able to play on these larger than life Western sort of tropes to make sense of her own life in a way that she's also authenticating her own life through these imageries. And then we're authenticating our experience of her thinking about these things too. So it creates this like feedback loop of just continually authenticating yourself through various forms of mediated imagery. And it just sort of keeps going and going. Like Taylor Swift draws on this, and then we draw on Taylor Swift, who's drawing on this, et cetera, et cetera. And then it creates these different sort of communities where like people dress up as different versions of Taylor because they feel that way or relate the most with that one or something. So Taylor Swift becomes basically like a mood chart to some degree, or a sort of zodiac sign, like a self-referential zodiac sign or something like this happening. There's also something interesting happening just with the word sort of I in this instance, and a lot of her music maybe. Could you talk about the use of the word I with an anti-hero, or just any of her other songs? What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously, I mean, well, maybe not obviously, but I think the idea, so to take Anti-Hero as an example, I mean, for people maybe who don't know the song, like, I guess the conceit of the song lyrically is that uh, well, actually, I should say more accurately, the first person narrator is the anti-hero in the song, and kind of like uh always, you know, always gets things wrong, kind of like scares everyone away, like is the problem in every kind of situation. um and I guess what that first person pronoun does really basically is it just like allows people to kind of imagine themselves in that position without necessarily having to contend with like it's not really identification with the character as much as it is just like co-optation of that position. Like you see it played out really literally in like TikTok lip sync, for example. The way the reason that song was so effective on TikTok is that, so it has this chorus line which is like, I'm the problem, it's me, and people are able to just clip that up and put whatever caption underneath of like whatever's happened to them, and then they kind of lip sync along to that, and there's the video, right? So it just allows people to perform that.
But it's that sort of dual. I don't know. It's fascinating. I can't tell whether when I listen to it, I sort of vacillate between two different subject positions. One of which is when she sings things like "I should not be left to my own devices." It almost feels as though we're sort of reading a diary entry in some sense. In a way, it doesn't feel as though it's kind of necessarily me feeling like I should be left to my own devices. I do feel that she's confessing something to me, but then in the choruses, it's me, hi, I'm the problem, it's me. I feel almost immediately that I can associate a lot more with that lyric I. And there's that kind of flipping, right? That in a way, it comes back to this problem about the tension of self and other here, and that sometimes there's an almost merging. Sometimes there's a sense that I am embodying the lyric I, and then in other cases, it feels as though someone is confessing something in such a way that, it's something very interior to them that they have not, literally the sense of confession, right? Sort of revealing something that was otherwise hidden. So yeah, I think to me, there's the power of that song also, as you say, is people can lip sync along to it. They can hear it through their headphones as though it's kind of occupying their own interior space in some way. But then there's also that almost social dimension to it.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, so I guess it's fulfilling two functions, which is the kind of window/mirror thing that sort of comes up.
Yeah, this sort of glass idea, right?
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
It does do both at once, so that it's never just about the artist and the image we have of them. It's also about what we bring to it as listeners.
Mm.
Yeah, that's great. And that's the thing that sort of gives us agency as well. Like we're presented with this sort of thing, right? We're presented with this window, and it could be a mirror into the self. And sort of art reflects in this, like art acts in this reflexive way in this sense. But it seems like what you were discussing also, the shifting modality of the lyric between being a confessional, being a diary, and therefore blurring, all seems to be headed under the category of just like the aesthetics of the confession or the aesthetics of honesty. And if it's like honesty is the larger sort of aesthetic guidance, then these things seem to be fitting within that category as well. And I'm just kind of curious about the music video. Is there any sort of, I think you guys also talk about the visual components of the music video within that. That must have been fun. So can you talk a little bit about the music video in regard to your analysis and authentication, et cetera, et cetera? And also the obvious sort of the monster thing has to do with the feeling of self, but also aspects of dysmorphia, queerness, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think the video bit is my favorite bit.
Yeah.
It's one of those sort of loopy moments where you feel like you've actually got to, I don't know, Swift Monster was something we hyphenated, I think, that she's sort of, we're really trying to sort of get into the head space there, I think, of what is she trying to convey here? It's this idea of a story, fairy tale-like situation. She keeps using this term, tale as old as time, which in and of itself is quite Beauty and the Beast, but also is meant to really suggest that her experience is timeless. And so in using these as she does, not only the signifiers in the lyrics, but also in the music video, she imagines herself, she sort of crawls into this room of what just looked like a sort of a load of, young professionals having a lovely dinner party. And sorry, you keep going blurry.
No, that's okay.
That's okay.
It's probably me.
No, I should stop moving so much.
No.
So there are these sort of young professionals at a dinner party, and as she enters, she's sort of brought, she's come along to join them at the table, and they're all absolutely petrified of her. And I don't know, I think the way that we're meant to feel is like that sense of when you feel insecure and you walk into a room and people are sort of looking at you. She's turning this into some sense of the grotesque, even though she's this completely beautiful kind of icon of white femininity. What do you think of it?
Yeah, it's quite something. I mean, yeah. She's also massive. Did you say that she was massive?
I don't know if I did.
Well, yeah, she's massive, and she's sort of crawling around, and she like tries to uh drink from a wine bottle. It's like empty. It's also really tiny compared to her.
Like in Alice in Wonderland, right?
Like in Alice
Yeah.
in Wonderland. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But then there's the lyrical references, and there's also a kind of weird kind of vampire metaphor that
Mhm.
kind of is about like staring into the sun, but not into the mirror, and this kind of thing, and like not wanting to confront some kind of stable identity, which is interesting in light of, I guess, what we've just been saying.
But actually, yeah, willing herself to have death instead of, the confronting herself. I mean, there is a part of the video, not the bit where she's enormous in the dinner, but there's a bit where she's sort of, I don't know, in a hotel room or something, and
Yeah,
is confronted by herself, who's sort of taking the piss out of her.
yeah, yeah.
That's kind of it, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, that's pretty much. Um,
And you can feel into it a great deal. I'm sure I don't exist in the subjectivity of a younger viewer watching it and sort of finding themselves reflected in some way. I don't know. Yeah, it sort of jumps between so many different things. I think this is the thing that I'm always just fascinated with Taylor Swift. It's so fragmented and seemingly incoherent, and yet deeply coherent and easily consumable.
yeah, and with constant reference to these stories or these like cultural tropes that appear timeless, I guess.
Yeah, of course. And it seems like this fragmentation is also the thing that aids in kind of listener identification. Because if it's fragmented and the story seems incoherent, well, guess what we could do? We could sort of use our effective labor to create a coherent story about this thing that's happening to then relate it to our own experiences. Because ultimately, like, we make it a story about ourselves, perhaps in some way. And pop music kind of reflects this, right? And if pop music is reflective or if art is reflective, obviously the mirror is like the central sort of metaphor guiding a lot of this stuff in different ways. One thing I was thinking about throughout this piece was like honesty works differently in different genres. Like, so if you're sort of working in different genres, like this idea of being authentic matters less and matters more, and it matters in different ways as well. So I was wondering if you could talk about like how authenticity and honesty might not be important to other genres, but somehow is super important to this genre. Like we could love artists and whatnot and not know how important is honesty to us liking an artist? Like because people like sort of, Banksy's identity or something was like revealed, but people liked his work. And well, what's more dishonest than sort of wearing a mask? But his work is honest because he's portraying something. So there's honesty somehow happening. So what does honesty have to do with us sort of appreciating or not appreciating it, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess I guess one thing I would say, I don't, yeah, I don't quite know what the answer is yet, but one thing I would say is that like it's it's really it's really like a way of listening or a way of interpreting that is like about suspicion. So it's not necessarily like part of it is like, yeah, so this music feels honest and therefore I connect with it or therefore I like it. But really it starts before that, which is like the way that I'm listening is to try and determine whether or not this feels true, whether or not this feels honest, which kind of in a way, I mean, whether you like Taylor Swift or not, I mean, there's a lot of people who probably don't like her on the grounds that it feels contrived or it feels like it's not honest, or like you say, like she's a billionaire, so this stuff can't be true. But it's in a way, it's the same thing. Like it's the same way of listening, which is just like I'm listening out for like the the kind of congruence or the identity between the performer and the real person, quote unquote, who's performing. Um, so I guess that goes really deep. Um, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess to me, it's a little bit like anything in consumerism. If you trust the product or the brand, you sort of you find that there are things about it that you wouldn't be as critical of. And I suppose it's that sort of sense, right, where you feel if you perceive a certain honesty in something, you consider it to be truthful, and you have a slightly more, I don't know, rose-tinted view of it. You have everything about it. You sort of just, oh, I just quite like her. I don't see that in that. And it's this sort of, it's all because of buying in, right? Not whether you mentioned affective labor. It's not just about buying in financially in terms of economic capital, but it's also about sort of buying in with time, personal investment, emotional investment in someone. And I think it's about, the fear of being let down. If you find a sort of consistent sense of credibility in something, you don't fear being let down by them as much. I mean, that's not always the truth, right? Some albums come out and they're absolutely awful, and you think to yourself, wow, why did I believe in that person for this period of time or whatever? But it is kind of like, the Michael Jackson issue, when people were complete, and still are, I think, completely at sea about how they're meant to feel and think about this person who, on the one hand, they've heard these negative things about, and on the other hand, represents something to them that they don't want to let go of. And yeah, I don't know. I think to me, that's why honesty matters so much in the way that we engage not only with brands, but artist brands as well.
Yeah, and so I guess it's also to do with like to what extent does your consumption of music like inform or power your like sense of identity and your sense of self. So of course it's completely natural that like if there's people, and particularly this happens with like young listeners, if they have favorite pop stars that are a really fundamental part of how they see themselves, or like that have really informed their self, their kind of sense of personal identity, then it makes total sense that for them it's important that there's some kind of honesty involved, because like the first thing you want about your sense of self is for it to feel like honest and singular and kind of true. So it might make a lot less sense to talk this way about like, I don't know, like like hymns that you hear in church, or like music you hear in the supermarket, or like whatever it is, because those are not necessarily kind of modes of listening that really inform your sense of identity in the same way. So that's, I think, like that's what's very unique about this mode of listening. And also, as you say, it's the danger, because of course, like in the end, there's always a risk, and this happens again and again, of like something happens and suddenly the image that you have is completely shattered. And then like what was reliant, like what about yourself was reliant on that kind of stable image is interesting. And so then it gets into a bit of more of a kind of moral question of like, to what extent is this aesthetic focus on honesty, like quote unquote a good thing, which we don't really get into, but it's an interesting question, I think.
But yeah, it's sort of if you think about the glass analogy that runs through the article, the sort of looking through a window, looking in a mirror, the article title has broken glass in it,
Yeah.
right? We're sort of thinking about this shattering. What happens when the veneer, the convincing veneer of something breaks? I think that's sort of the next step on this particular way of thinking about confessionality that I'm interested in, is what happens when confessionality breaks down or sort of starts to fracture.
Yeah, I would agree.
Oh, there we go. We've decided on what we're going to write about next.
Yeah,
Oh, that's good. Thanks.
Thanks, Lee.
This has been great, Lee. It's like a free therapy.
That's great. I want to be co-author. Anyway, so I think that's really great, right? So we imagine, and for some reason we have expectations of honesty in something, and so honesty becomes a criterion of of judgment of the thing, how honest it is, right? But of course, we'll never know. So we have our own sort of criterion of what that means and feels like, right? What feels honest in some way. But when honesty is then thwarted or fragmented or broken, with Taylor Swift, she has this really convenient thing called recreating or redoing herself in some ways, right? Which has happened all of the time, where the various images of Taylor and the honesty of that were shattered. And then she just reinvents herself in some way. Like artists do this all the time. There's an article actually, like, I've read, like, interestingly enough, like 3 articles on Taylor Swift or something, and one's just coming to my mind, and it was how she navigated becoming, going from a country star to a pop star, and like the aspects of like how whiteness and race worked and how authenticity worked. And she was like authenticating herself by being bad at being a pop star and stuff, and it lent her into like this quirkiness. I think the article was about like quirky hipsterdom or something. So I think artists have a way, certain artists have a way of dealing with this too. And in a way, if her sort of like being like, you could create any version you want of me, she's already prepared for this fragmenting to happen, much like sort of like neoliberalism, co-ops the things that could undermine it in some way. Taylor Swift and her team already have this plan or safeguard in place or something like this. If that makes sense. What do you guys think?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. But also, there's something interesting to be said about like the added value, or the like the productive value under this kind of neoliberal regime of like bouncing back, of like being the underdog and then coming back. So I know that that album Reputation was basically all about that. It was like, I've had so much criticism, and like I'm kind of like making a comeback, and you know what I mean? It's just it's like the potential energy that is generated by like dying and then coming back to life, I guess.
Literally dying, right? Why not kill off yourself or your previous version of yourself before the media does?
Yeah.
I'm just thinking here as a Brit about the when Jerry Halliwell left the Spice Girls, right? And she did this song "Look at Me," and in the video of it, there's her own funeral, well, the funeral of Ginger Spice, because this is this new era of Jerry Halliwell, Jerry Halliwell, and oh my God, thank God that career really went on, didn't it? But like, in this way, Taylor Swift, there's in that song, "Look What You Made Me Do" from Reputation, she's on the phone. Oh, I'm sorry, the old Taylor can't come to the phone right now because she's dead. I mean, there's so much. This is another thing actually that we didn't put in the article, but we wanted to when we were looking at all these different references to mirrors and things and glass. We also found that there's such a prevalent theme in her work of death and killing.
Yeah, specifically her own death.
Her own death, but also the death of like the wife of her ex who lives at the end of her garden. And she's like, she's really nice and she brings me flowers or bread or whatever, I can't remember. I want to kill her. Yeah. And we were like, why do you want to kill her, Taylor? Like, also, do we need to have a conversation?
Yeah.
Maybe.
Do we need to have a conversation?
No, we probably do.
I think we are.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. There's a real thing of death and bouncing back. That's interesting.
Okay, so very much like a sort of Christ martyrdom figure in some way, rising, Lazarus, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm now very interested to hear and think about sort of Taylor Swift and violence and homicide, and like the aesthetics of violence within Taylor Swift sounds amazing. So another article we can all work on as well. So I guess, is there anything you feel like we should cover before we should go?
Sure.
I suppose the article ends in a way by, it ends quite ambivalently, because I don't think that either of us are, we're sort of sitting on the fence. Really, the article is more diagnostic than it is hugely critical, but it does suggest at the end, perhaps sometimes we should take a step back from this glass-like image that we're making here of these media personalities, or at least consumption engagement with media in general. And I suppose it's a slightly, I don't know, we spent quite a long time on thinking of how to end it, because there's a sense of, you don't want to sound moralizing, right? There's no sort of particular, yes, there's an ethics to this. There's an ethics to everything, of course. But there's no sense that I ever want to suggest to somebody, you shouldn't engage with the music, the media, whatever that you enjoy. I think what we really want is that people engage with things and are able to take a little bit of critical distance at points. I think otherwise there can be this real sense of being sort of swallowed up by particular images. But I don't know necessarily that I felt at the end of the piece that I'd really worked out what my advice would be. I don't know if I meant to advise, but
no, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I guess it's a little like what I said earlier. I mean, what is the consequence of this like aesthetic interest in honesty, and is in like listening to, or consuming, to put it that way, confessional pop music as a mode of like self self-authentication.
Mm.
Like, what are the consequences of this? And then what happens when that image is revealed to be false, or manufactured in some way? Because, like, to be fair, it doesn't have to be a problem. It doesn't have to be a bad thing that, like, Taylor Swift is a billionaire, but she's actually singing about being, having huge problems. I'm not. It's not that that's bad because it's not true. It's just that a lot of the discourse surrounding kind of all pop music, but obviously confessional pop music in particular, is like honesty as a marker of whether or not uh, it's worthy of being listened to and selling, which is, yeah, it's just that's like interesting as like a cultural phenomenon. And that, like, I think you do see real like, yeah, really, really positive things that come out of that for people.
Mm.
And also real problems that are created, not just for listeners, but also for artists, to be fair. I mean, maybe wouldn't feel too sorry for, like, Taylor Swift, for the kind of interest that she generates, but, like, it's a real problem for a lot of artists that they have this, like, invasion uh, of privacy, and, like, a real interest in their personal lives as almost like a form of critical inquiry, um, which is, is that the kind of cultural climate that we want? I don't know.
Yeah, it's you have to really try and work out what you want as an artist before you've even started as an artist. I think nowadays,
Yeah.
if you're happy to put yourself on the international stage and propel, your private life into the media, often it works brilliantly to catch people. But
Mhm.
of course, there are these after effects, and the fact that you have to be so prepared for that as an artist now is quite interesting. But I was thinking a lot at the moment about this Lily Allen record that came
Yeah,
out, and
exactly. Yeah.
just how much seemed to have captured something that people really wanted to buy into, which I guess was a kind of, yeah, babe, he was so in the wrong and we're so on your side. But it really is this sort of literal, not literal, actually, figurative airing of dirty laundry.
Literal.
It's a literal airing of dirty
Yeah.
laundry, yeah.
No, right. Yeah. Yeah.
No, that's great. Sorry, go on.
No, no, no. I was just going to say, obviously, yes, I know. I was just going to agree with that, I think.
Thanks, babe.
Sorry about that. Sorry to cut you off. I was thinking, like, what sort of I'm glad you brought up the conclusion, because I thought, like, this is a to be continued sort of thing. Like, this is what's going on and we're not totally sure of what to do about it, but this is sort of the thing. And I'm glad you brought that up. But I also think I was thinking, why one potential sort of conclusion or something that come out of this is sort of like, why do we demand more honesty from Taylor Swift and artists rather than those in charge, or et cetera, like politicians, et cetera? Why are we this feels like to me as form of a displaced honesty or something. Like, we should want our honesty somewhere else or something. Like, this could be a distraction in some way. What do you guys think?
I agree on one level, but also I think you could look at it a different way and say we have had a huge um, cultural shift of demanding more, like, openness and straight talkingness from our politicians. I mean, to me, Donald Trump is, like, really a manifestation of this idea that, like, everything should be out in the open. Every opinion that you have, every thought that comes into your head, and whether or not the stuff he says is factually true is, like, obviously that's a different issue. But he is, like, people would frequently refer to him as, like, he's not polished, he's not like a really presented, like,
Media trained.
media trained politician, as if these are all good things. And I think that's interesting that, like, we talk about, like, dirt and rawness and this kind of thing as if they're, you know aesthetically or politically desirable traits, whereas, like, in any other area of life, like, you wouldn't eat it. You know what I mean? It's interesting, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, this rawness, dirt, this all speaks to different levels of sort of consumability and metabolization in some way. Um, yeah, that's definitely sort of a good point, right? There's just like naked imperialism and racism going on, so that's definitely something that's weirdly appreciated because now sort of critical theory scholars don't have to be like, look, they could just and then sort of do the work. Like he'll do the work for everyone in some way, you know. Um, the last thing I wanted to ask about is because we're at the ending, right? We're talking about the ending. Is how you tie into Lou Reed into the beginning and the ending as well, because we have to touch on that because you started with it and you end with it. I thought it was very well done. So say a little more.
This is Max's genius joke. So over to you.
There's this Lou Reed interview in which someone, I think an Australian journalist, he's basically being really catty towards this like press room, and this Australian journalist asked him, you know, you sing a lot about sadomasochism and homosexuality. Like, are you either a sadomasochist or a homosexual? And he's like, what has it got to do with me? Or something like this. And he's like, oh, I know, sometimes it depends. I think later, we don't quote it, but I think later he's like, it's a way to pass the time or something like that. But yeah, and I guess so at the start, the question that we sort of pose is like, well, what does it mean for him to say that it doesn't matter? Like that seems like, because his songs are so, to use that word again, so raw and feel so full of like this emotional power. It seems really like incongruent to then say, well, you know, the truth value of all of that is like, is immaterial. But of course that like, it's true that if you really think about it, and this is how it kind of comes to the end, that like, it's not, we talk about lyrics or music like casting light on their writers or on their performers, but like there's no inherent reason why it should work that way. And even if you cast more light on something, it doesn't necessarily mean that you like know it any better. It just means that you can like see the surface of it a little better, I guess. So it's I think that little fragment, even though maybe the kind of left turn from Louis to Taylor Swift is pretty like, feels pretty stark, I think that fragment just is a good way of showing that like that relationship between utterance on the one hand and like a kind of personal knowing on the other hand is like is in a way arbitrary and could also be different.
And it's the starkness of the difference that works so well, because we feel, even if it's implicit, you know, that we demand an honesty of pop stars. There has to be at least some kind of identity between what they're singing about and who they are. And so it feels in this contemporary moment of this confessional pop aesthetic we're writing about, that this feels, you know, so strange. It's such a bizarre thing. And I think often you can exemplify the thing you're talking about so brilliantly by bringing in its opposite.
No, that's great. And yeah, the Lou Reed thing made me think of like the death of the author sort of business and whatnot, right? Um, so this was really fun. I learned a lot, got to talk about Taylor Swift, which is always a fun thing to do. So any either, I guess, concluding remarks, as I asked before, or just stuff you're working on now, and also how people could keep up with your work. And also you could shout out musical projects you do as well, of course.
What are you working on right now?
Well, we've just decided that we're going to do the follow-up to this, so that's great.
Yeah.
We're also toying with this piece about Beyonce that we've been cooking up for a while. What am I working on? I've got to finish a book. I'm writing a book, finishing a book about intimacy and headphone listening. Yeah, too many things, too many projects I haven't finished yet. What about you?
Yeah. Well, I actually, last time I spoke to you, I was writing about seancing and about Rosemary Brown, the spiritualist, which I've done now. And now, yeah, I'm doing a project now about kind of hipsterism and hipster aesthetics, which kind of came up a little bit earlier. So that's an interesting kind of, it's another, in my mind, another kind of offshoot of this project, maybe the kind of first half of it. Yeah, I'm doing some musical projects as well, but it's all, you can keep up with it all on the internet, I guess. And same is true for you.
Yeah, Instagram,
Yes.
because we can't go on Twitter anymore.
Yep. And most of the internet is insufferable anyway. So very
That's
cool.
true.
Everyone can find you on the internet. All right. So perfect. Thank you so much, guys. Appreciate your time. And if you ever want to sort of chat about any of your upcoming projects, love to have you back on, of course.
Thank you so
Thank you
much,
so
Lee.
much.
Of course.